On August 16, 1977, the world lost not just the king of rock and roll but a man whose final hours remain shrouded in questions that have haunted fans, family, and medical experts for nearly 5 decades. Elvis Aaron Presley, just 42 years old and still capable of selling out arenas across America, was found unresponsive in the bathroom of his Graceland mansion by his girlfriend Ginger Alden, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever change how we understand the price of unprecedented fame. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, but the reality of what happened during Elvis's last day alive reveals a far more complex and heartbreaking story than the simple medical explanation suggests. Those closest to him during his final months had watched the man who had revolutionized popular music slowly disappear behind a haze of prescription medications, crushing loneliness, and the suffocating pressure of living up to a legend that had grown far beyond the small-town boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who had started it all. What makes Elvis's death particularly tragic is not just how young he was but how preventable it might have been if the people around him had been willing to confront the devastating reality of his condition. The final 24 hours of his life were marked by a series of decisions, conversations, and missed opportunities that paint a picture of a man desperately seeking relief from pain that went far deeper than any physical ailment could explain. The events of August 16 didn't begin that morning but rather represented the culmination of years of decline that those in his inner circle had either failed to recognize or felt powerless to address. Elvis had spent the previous weeks in a state of increasing agitation and physical discomfort, struggling with insomnia that had plagued him for years and relying on a dangerous cocktail of prescription drugs that his personal physician had been providing with alarming frequency. What happened during those final hours reveals not just the circumstances of his death but the profound isolation and desperation that had come to define his existence. The man who could command the attention of thousands from a concert stage had become virtually imprisoned within his own home, surrounded by employees rather than friends, dependent on medications rather than genuine human connection, and trapped within a version of success that had long since stopped bringing him joy. The untold truth behind Elvis Presley's final hours is not just about how he died but about how he had been forced to live in the years leading up to that tragic August day. It's a story that exposes the dark side of fame, the failure of those entrusted with his care, and the heartbreaking reality of what happens when a human being becomes more valuable as a commodity than as a person. The Elvis Presley who walked the halls of Graceland in the summer of 1977 bore little resemblance to the electrifying performer who had captivated audiences just a decade earlier. Those who knew him intimately described a man who had become a prisoner of his own success, unable to leave his Memphis mansion without being mobbed by fans, yet increasingly unable to find peace within its walls. The prescription drug dependency that would ultimately contribute to his death had begun innocently enough years earlier, prescribed by doctors to help him cope with the physical demands of constant touring and the crushing anxiety that came with being the most famous person in America. By 1977, Elvis's daily routine had become a carefully orchestrated dance around his medication schedule. Dr. George Nichopoulos, his personal physician known as Dr. Nick, had been providing him with an alarming array of prescription drugs, including powerful painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants that created a dangerous cycle of artificial highs and devastating crashes. Those closest to Elvis later revealed that he had become obsessed with the precise timing of his medications, often becoming agitated or even violent when his pills were delayed or when anyone questioned his increasing dependency. The physical toll of this lifestyle was becoming impossible to hide, even with the elaborate stage costumes and careful camera angles that his team employed during his final performances. Elvis had gained significant weight, his speech had become slurred, and his movements, once fluid and graceful, had become labored and unpredictable. Friends who had known him since his early days in Memphis were shocked by his appearance during his final months, describing a man who seemed to have aged decades in just a few years. More troubling than his physical decline was the emotional isolation that had begun to consume him. Despite being surrounded constantly by his Memphis Mafia, the group of friends and employees who handled every aspect of his daily life, Elvis had confided to several people that he felt profoundly lonely and misunderstood. The men around him had become dependent on him financially, creating a dynamic where honest conversations about his health or behavior became virtually impossible. They were employees first and friends second, and everyone understood that challenging Elvis's decisions could mean losing access to the generous lifestyle he provided. Ginger Alden, his girlfriend during his final months, later described watching helplessly as Elvis struggled with severe insomnia that would keep him awake for days at a time. He would spend hours reading spiritual books, seeking answers to questions that his fame and fortune couldn't address, desperately trying to understand why success had brought him so little genuine happiness. The man who had everything the world thought he could want was quietly drowning in plain sight of everyone around him. The week leading up to Elvis Presley's death was marked by increasingly erratic behavior that should have served as urgent warnings to those responsible for his care but instead were dismissed as typical eccentricities from a man whose entire life had become abnormal. On August 10, just 6 days before his death, Elvis had visited his dentist, Dr. Lester Hoffman, for what should have been a routine appointment but instead became another opportunity for him to obtain more prescription medications. The visit lasted several hours longer than necessary, during which Elvis reportedly received additional painkillers that further complicated his already dangerous medication regimen. During this final week, several people close to Elvis noticed dramatic changes in his behavior that went beyond his usual unpredictability. His longtime friend and bodyguard, Red West, who had recently been dismissed from Elvis's inner circle, later revealed that he had been planning to write a tell-all book about Elvis's drug dependency, hoping that the public exposure might force his friend to seek the treatment he desperately needed. The irony was devastating. One of the few people willing to risk everything to save Elvis had been cut off from him just weeks before his death. Ginger Alden described Elvis as particularly agitated during those final days, unable to sleep for extended periods and becoming increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of those around him. He had begun expressing fears that people were trying to control him or take advantage of his generosity, a concern that wasn't entirely unfounded given the financial dependence of his entire organization on his continued ability to perform and generate income. The pressure of an upcoming tour scheduled to begin on August 17 had added another layer of stress to his already fragile mental state. Perhaps most telling was Elvis's increasing preoccupation with death and spirituality during his final week. He had spent hours discussing with friends his fascination with near-death experiences and his belief in life after death, conversations that, in hindsight, seem like a man preparing for his own departure. His reading habits had shifted almost entirely to books about spirituality, meditation, and the afterlife, as if he were seeking answers to questions that his earthly success had failed to address. The most chilling warning sign came just 2 days before his death, when Elvis suffered what appeared to be a minor overdose during a visit to his dentist. Rather than seeking emergency medical attention or confronting the severity of his condition, those around him simply helped him recover and continued with their normal routines. This incident, which should have served as a wake-up call about the lethal danger of his medication abuse, was instead treated as just another day in the increasingly surreal world of Graceland, where Elvis's problems were managed rather than solved. August 16, 1977, began like many other days in Elvis Presley's increasingly isolated world, with the king of rock and roll waking in the late afternoon after another sleepless night spent reading and trying to find peace that had eluded him for years. What made this day different wasn't any single dramatic event, but rather the accumulation of small decisions and missed opportunities that would prove fatal. Elvis had spent the previous evening at a private screening of a movie with friends, appearing relatively normal to those around him, though several people later noted that he seemed unusually reflective and subdued. That Tuesday evening, Elvis made what would be his final public appearance, visiting his dentist Dr. Hoffman once again for what was ostensibly routine dental work but which provided another opportunity to obtain prescription medications. The appointment lasted until nearly midnight, during which Elvis received a significant amount of pain medication that added to the dangerous cocktail already in his system. When he returned to Graceland around 12:30 a.m. on August 16, he appeared drowsy but alert enough to spend time with Ginger and discuss plans for the upcoming tour that was scheduled to begin the following day. The final hours of Elvis's life unfolded with tragic predictability. Unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, he spent time playing piano and reading, two activities that had always brought him comfort during his darkest moments. Around 4 a.m., he took his prescribed sleep medication, a combination that included Placidil, Valium, and other sedatives that Dr. Nikopoulos had provided. When these failed to bring the rest he desperately sought, Elvis made the fatal decision to take additional medication without consulting anyone about the potential interactions. Ginger Alden later described their final conversation, which occurred around 9 a.m. when Elvis told her he was going to the bathroom to read. His last words to her were casual and unremarkable. He mentioned that he couldn't sleep and planned to continue reading until he felt tired enough to rest. There was nothing in his demeanor to suggest that this would be their final exchange, no dramatic farewell or expression of despair that might have served as a warning. At approximately 2 p.m., Ginger discovered Elvis unconscious on the bathroom floor of his master suite, a book about spiritual healing fallen beside him. His face was buried in the thick carpeting, and despite immediate attempts at resuscitation by paramedics, Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital at 3:30 p.m. The autopsy would later reveal that he had 14 different drugs in his system, with the combination of sedatives reaching levels that made survival impossible. In the immediate aftermath of Elvis Presley's death, those closest to him made a series of decisions that would obscure the truth about his final hours for decades. Colonel Tom Parker, his longtime manager, was primarily concerned with protecting the Elvis brand and ensuring that upcoming projects would continue generating revenue. Dr. Nikopoulos, facing potential criminal charges for his role in Elvis's prescription drug dependency, began a careful campaign to shift blame away from the dangerous medication regimen he had been providing for years. The initial autopsy results, which revealed the shocking extent of Elvis's drug dependency, were quickly suppressed in favor of a more palatable explanation. The official cause of death, cardiac arrhythmia, was technically accurate but deliberately vague, avoiding any mention of the 14 different prescription drugs found in his system or the dangerously high levels of sedatives that had actually caused his heart to stop. This sanitized version of events protected everyone involved while denying fans and the general public the truth they needed to understand how preventable this tragedy had been. What emerged years later, through investigative reporting and testimony from those brave enough to speak honestly, revealed a system of enablement that had essentially turned Elvis into a victim of his own success. The Memphis Mafia, Dr. Nikopoulos, and even Colonel Parker had all benefited financially from maintaining Elvis's ability to perform, regardless of the cost to his health or well-being. The man who had brought joy to millions had been systematically isolated from anyone willing to prioritize his survival over their own financial interests. The truth about Elvis's final hours serves as a devastating indictment of how society treats its most celebrated figures. His death wasn't just the result of prescription drug abuse but of a culture that valued his productivity more than his humanity. The people entrusted with his care had failed him completely, choosing profit over intervention, enabling over confrontation, and silence over the difficult conversations that might have saved his life. Today, nearly 50 years after his death, Elvis Presley's final hours continue to serve as a cautionary tale about the price of fame and the responsibility we all share for protecting those whose talent brings us joy. His story reminds us that behind every larger-than-life celebrity is a human being who needs genuine care, honest relationships, and people willing to say no when their life depends on it. The king of rock and roll died alone in his bathroom, surrounded by wealth and fame but lacking the one thing that might have saved him, someone who loved him enough to risk everything to get him the help he needed. What do you think could have been done differently to save Elvis? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more untold stories from music history.